The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, welcome everybody. For those who've been here before, welcome back. It's time for another of the MadCap Software webinar series. This time we have some amazing guest presenters from VAS, and they're going to be talking about how to work with MadCap Flare if you're doing API style documentation. I know that's been a hot topic. A lot of people have been, asking for content in that area. So this should be a pretty good webinar. Now, before we dive in and start though, there is a little bit of housekeeping to talk about. And those of you who have been to our webinars before, you probably already know this, but for those of you who might be new, one, you don't have to ask. Yes, this webinar will be recorded. And anybody who signed up, whether they attend live or not, they will be receiving an email with a link to the recorded webinar. So if something goes by real fast and maybe you miss it, don't panic. Later today, tomorrow at the latest, expect in your inbox to receive an email thanking you for your attendance and with a link to the recording. The other item is when it comes to questions. With a group this size, all of your microphones are on mute. That will protect your privacy. Nobody can hear what's happening in your office. But that says, okay, well then how can I ask questions? Well, as part of the GoToWebinar interface that we are using, there is a questions panel. Now, it's kind of twofold. Feel free to type in a question anytime you want. However, there will be some dedicated time at the end of the webinar where questions will be addressed. So you don't have to wait until the end to ask your question, but recognize if you type a question into that question panel, 5 minutes into the webinar, it won't be addressed until we get to that dedicated question and answer time at the end. All right, so I think that's all of the announcements I have. I will turn it over to our guest hosts from VAS.
Thank you, Mike, and hello, everyone. It is great to be here with you today. I'm Athena Adkisson, and I'm the Manager of Technical Documentation at Valley Ag Software, where I work with a talented team of writers to document dairy and herd management products. I have a master's degree in technical and professional writing from Northeastern University and over 25 years of experience as a technical editor, writer, and trainer in industries ranging from telecom to environmental regulations and now to dairy farming. As a former frame maker and RoboHelp user, I made the shift to MadCap Flare around 10 years ago and have never looked back. I find that it strongly supports a tech writer's need to design and maintain easy-to-use documentation. I also consider it to be the foundation of a strong documentation team, especially because of its ability to integrate with source control. I also enjoy leveraging its content sharing features like imports, snippets, variables, and conditions to promote a positive user experience. And I am here today with my teammate, Jana Kromer.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Athena. I'm Jana Kromer, and I've been a technical writer for over 20 years. I'm located in the Kansas City area and have worked remotely from here for the last 10 years. My writing experience includes many years in the casino gaming and technology consulting industries, and I made the jump over to dairy tech with VAS in early 2019. That's when I first started using Flare, after many years of working with Adobe FrameMaker and before that, RoboHelp. One of my proudest achievements at VAS early on was learning Flare and publishing our first ever API help build within a few months of starting with the company. I really enjoyed taking complex concepts and distilling them into something the average human can understand. So I love the techie and nerdy side of tech writing. After joining VAS, I latched onto the power and beauty of content reuse and variables and conditions, as well as the speed at which you can use Flare to generate and deliver online help. I do want to pause and make it clear that I am not a developer or an API expert, but I have learned a lot since starting to document our API. And I'm very excited for this opportunity to share my findings with our tech writing community and my fellow Flare users. Before we get started, we'd like to poll our attendees to help us understand our audience. The first question is, there we go. The first question is, do you currently work on API documentation? You should see a poll screen with the option to respond. I'll give everyone a few seconds to enter their answer.
So the results of the poll are that we have about 58% of the audience who is currently working on API documentation and about 42% who are not.
Okay, interesting. Our second, and then we have one more question for you. Have you used Flare for API documentation? And I'll give you a few seconds to respond as well.
Okay, so a little different results there. So 27% are using MadCap Flare for API documentation and 73% have not.
Interesting. Okay, so now that we know a little more about everyone in the audience, let's move on with the presentation. I'm going to quickly go over our agenda for this session. Athena will kick us off by explaining our challenge of delivering high-quality API help quickly. We'll then give a basic intro regarding what an API is and why APIs need documentation. I'll also give you some recommendations on getting started and developing a strategy for documenting your API. We'll also cover the planning and organizing steps that we took. And we'll focus the majority of our talk on explaining the main challenges we encountered while executing and delivering our help solution. And we hope to leave some time at the end to allow you to ask questions, or as Mike mentioned, to respond to questions. And now I will hand it over to Athena.
So when considering our API documentation challenge, I'd like to give some context on our API in general. VAS has been a tech leader in the dairy industry since the 1980s, and our software is the most commonly used herd management solution in the US. We primarily track animal health and treatments, their feed and diet, and most importantly for the dairy farmer, their milk production. We started shifting from our on-premise software model to a cloud-based product back in 2018, and it took off. Many of our existing on-premise partners immediately wanted to partner with our cloud product, and new companies wanted to as well. So one example is a product called Cattle Eye. It turns a dairy's security cameras into an identification and monitoring tool that checks for lameness whenever animals enter or leave the parlor. Another is NEDAP, which is basically a Fitbit for cows. It typically hangs around the animal's neck and it tracks their activity. It then sends the data back to the cloud, and dairy farmers can review it in a dashboard to learn all kinds of information about the animal's health and well-being. Our dev leaders knew that moving to an API on our cloud product would make connecting with technology partners like Cattle Eye and NEDAP much easier. So they set out to deliver an API with standardized data points that follow the global ICAR standard, which also made partnering with tech companies outside of the US easier. So that then led to the Tech Docs Challenge. Our documentation team, meaning only myself at the time, was tasked with developing industry-leading API documentation without ever having written API documentation before. Our main directive was to create a standalone help system that third-party API developers could use to integrate their products with our own cloud product with little to no direct support from the VAS development team. Quite fortunately, we were able to bring Yana on board at that time. Unfortunately for her, though, the documentation was needed for the first partner integration fast, within about 3 months after she started. Yana was the one who primarily rose to this challenge, and she embraced it even. So she's the one that created most of the solution you'll see today. She was new to Flare, so my primary contribution was to help guide her toward the features that would best support the solution she chose to implement. And with that, I will hand it back over to Yana.
Thanks, Athena. So I had to quickly learn what exactly an API is and why we should document it. API stands for Application Programming Interface, and APIs are the fundamental building blocks of data sharing and communication across different software products. You're likely using an API every time you open a browser or interact with software that connects to the internet. At VAS, our cloud product even uses an API to connect the front end that you see in a browser or the UI to the back end, which handles the processing of user inputs. You may also see the word REST or RESTful used to describe an API. All that means is that the API uses standard HTTP methods to handle data with GET, POST, and other standard methods. It also follows a specific client-server architecture that includes resources. I'll cover HTTP methods and resources a bit later during our API help demo. And I have a link here to an article I recommend to introduce the concept of APIs. The article is brief, fun, and not overly technical.
So why do APIs need documentation? The API docs allow your organization to more easily collaborate with other companies. Our primary audience for the documentation is developers, but it may also include others like product managers, business analysts, project managers, and maybe even other fantastic technical writers. At VAS, we have an internal integrations team that develops and maintains the API, and we work closely with them to make sure the docs are accurate and up to date. Without comprehensive documentation, our development team would have to walk each and every partner through how the API works and what the data means, which would be pretty inefficient. By being able to refer partner developers to our documentation, our dev team can focus their valuable time on new development and expanding the API. Then their support is only needed for the more complex issues that a third-party developer might encounter. Having our API documented also ensures that the information we share with our partners is consistent. In other words, VAS cannot inadvertently tell one partner one thing and then tell another something slightly different. What's in the docs is the final word.
Okay, so when I joined VAS, I knew I needed to become familiar with the inner workings of APIs, as well as the best strategies for documenting them. To get started, I researched options for API documentation training, and I found Tom Johnson's website, I'dRatherBeWriting.com. His API writing tutorial was a fantastic starting point, and I cannot recommend it enough. Tom covers the most important aspects of documenting APIs in an easy-to-follow format. And as part of the training, Tom showcases great examples of API docs, which was a great place to begin. So if you're just getting started, you may want to do some research and check out the API docs of other companies. I also pinged our dev team and integrations product managers for their input on helpful API docs, and I checked out their recommendations. Other tools that we've used and find helpful include Swagger and Postman. Swagger is a commonly used tool for API docs. Our dev team automatically generated a Swagger reference page for our API, and it was a good starting point, but it was missing a lot of the details we needed to specify for our partner companies. We also wanted to have a little bit more control over the output and to be able to hide or exclude some endpoints. Postman is another great tool for working with APIs. First of all, it's free. You can use Postman to send and receive real API requests and responses, which is really handy for capturing code samples. You'll probably need to work with your dev team to access credentials for authentication purposes and for a quick rundown of the API URL and the parameters you need to use. But after that, you should be able to get started working on your API directly using Postman. Now, for an overview of our strategy for tackling this challenge. First, learn the API, then learn Flare, and then finally learn the team processes and tools that it takes to get all of this done. Piece of cake, right? Well, not exactly. My first task was to learn all I could about our API and fast. Every API is unique and the resources and methods it uses are different. API help is never a one-size-fits-all approach. I reviewed all existing reference materials our developers had assembled, and I spent a lot of time meeting with the members of the dev team and our experts in dairy data. Initially, I had to ask about every single data point and what it means, but as I became more and more comfortable with our industry terms and product features, I was able to do some research and develop new help topics on my own and then request an SME review of my draft content. I slowly got better and better at figuring out new endpoints. In parallel, I also had to learn Flare. I spent a few days when I was brand new at VAS doing the online beginner training for Flare, which was really helpful. I've used so many documentation tools in the past that I assumed I could pick this one up without issue. But there was definitely a learning curve. I would say that having experience in some basic HTML coding is handy when picking up Flare, as are the concepts of variables and conditions. Being able to start from Athena's existing Flare project with the conditions, variables, and branding I needed definitely helped me hit the ground running. And a huge thanks to Athena for her support in helping me learn Flare in a short amount of time. And in addition to learning about the API and how to use Flare, I also had to become intimately familiar with the more advanced Flare tools. The ones I specifically needed to design the API help were targets, variables, style sheets, skins, and publishing, as well as GitHub for source control. We have an automated process to handle publishing our help builds to AWS, thankfully. So once I got a grip on source control with Git, we were ready to publish. Planning and organizing. Once I learned what API docs are and how our API works, I set out to make the best API help possible. I wanted to make it user-friendly, intuitive, thorough, and scalable. I'm going to show you our API help and demo how we ended up structuring our help, as well as how we ended up covering endpoint details. So I'm going to switch over to a browser real quick. Okay, so here is our API help landing page, which gives you quick access to the main help areas and popular topics. The sections are also available here on the left nav. I should also note that our API help is not responsive by design because our development team explained that developers will most likely be viewing the help from a larger monitor while they're working. So that was one less thing to worry about. We have a getting started section here, which helps our partners kick off the process of integrating with VAS. Here we offer contact info for our integrations team, as well as a couple of links to helpful content. Authentication. This topic includes a diagram to show how our API processes requests and uses an API key and token to provide secure access to our data. It also makes it clear to expect our API to respond using JSON. We also include general API request information to cover what we expect an API request to contain. The request needs to include the HTTP method, the URL, the resource, parameters, and authentication details in the header. When you work on documenting APIs, you need to develop an understanding of how your API is generally structured. Are your resources nested, or are there any other unique attributes to your data? Our nested resources topic shows our unique data structure. As you can see in the diagram, our resources are nested. Each dairy includes zones, which contain pens, and then each pen includes individual animals. Moving on to the most critical section in our help, the resources. This section contains the details of all of our data, grouped by resource. I ended up going with the left side navigation to make our solution scalable and easy to maintain. As we add more resources and endpoints, we have the space and structure to handle them here. And as this diagram shows, our API provides access to VAS data, including several unique resources. Now I'm going to walk you through the details we include for each endpoint. We cover each endpoint in a single topic under its respective resource, and then use the endpoint topic to drill down into the details. Let's take a look at the animals resource. And I'm going to walk you through the calves endpoint. We always offer a brief summary of what the endpoint is for at the top of the page. We include the HTTP method the endpoint supports, in this case, just get, which means a partner can pull calf details from the dairy over into their system. We always provide the URL of the API and the path to the endpoint. We also specify which parameters are required and which others are available and optional. For calves, a required parameter is the dairy ID, and optional parameters are since date and include animals and state. The query parameters will allow our partners to limit the results returned, for instance, to only calves born in January or only calves currently active in the system. I include sample requests, one with and one without query parameters. You can pull the sample request from Postman or whichever tool you use to access your API. It includes the method here, get, the URL, which includes the path to the endpoint, and then there's placeholder here for authentication details. Then the response is what the API returns to the request. As you can see here, our response code is nicely formatted and key elements are colored to make the reading of the code much easier. This is what's known as syntax highlighting, and most developers expect to have this feature in the tools they use to view or edit their code. And below the response code, we have the most important details of our API data, the response schema. Here we detail what each data point means. For instance, our partners may need to have a full understanding of how VAS identifies calves and all animals. Well, here we explain in great detail and with an illustration the difference between a cow number, which is on an ear tag, and an ISO ID, which is also on the ear but looks and works differently. These two items are both used to identify animals on farm and in our system. Our partners might need these critical details to determine which data points they should pull from our system into their application, and our documentation helps them make that decision. And as you can see here, we have a lot of details to include for each endpoint. And that's why we have this little back to top button, so you can get back up and get to other areas of the topic quickly. We also have this collapse and expand button, which allows you to quickly collapse and open all of the drop downs below. Okay, getting back to our presentation. Okay, so now on to our first challenge, delivering docs quickly for two environments. As a new Flare user, I knew I needed support for how to handle publishing two very similar help builds, one for the production environment and one for the sandbox environment, where our partners can test out their connection to our API. The only difference between the two sets of docs is that the URL you need to use is a little different. I reached out to Athena for help, and here's how she guided me.
Jana had worked a bit with our conditions and variables by this time, but it was mainly through snippets, which were on a smaller content sharing scale than we needed for this challenge. So I felt that the best solution was to use the custom targets combined with variable definitions. Excuse me. The first step was to create the two targets. Excuse me. One for the production API help. Excuse me, just a moment. Okay, so the first step was to create the two targets, one for the production API help and one for the sandbox API help. The second step was to create a variable for the production URL and add a variable definition for the sandbox or our staging URL. Jana could then insert that variable everywhere she needed to specify the URL. For example, in Jana's demo of the API help, she showed the primary URL in the general API request information section. She also showed it in that calves endpoint topic where she indicated the URL that was required to send the request. So she inserted this variable in all of those locations for every endpoint in many places throughout her topics. The third and fourth steps were then to open each of the targets we created in step 1, go to the variables tab within the target, and select the variable definition that would be used globally in each respective help target. This was the most simple and straightforward solution, and it turned out to work well. In the sandbox target, every URL displayed the sandbox URL variable definition, and every URL in the production help displayed the production URL variable definition. Now I'm going to hand it back over to Jana to cover our next challenge.
Okay, so our second challenge was how should we handle displaying large blocks of JSON code in the response code samples. I did want to note here real quick that we were creating our API help before MadCap added the code snippet feature, so that was not available at the time. Fortunately, one of our developers pointed out that syntax highlighting would make the code much easier to read. I promptly Googled syntax highlighting and got to work researching our options. I found a syntax highlighting website called Prism and was lured in by the simplicity of the setup. It requires only 2 files, a style sheet, and a small JavaScript to implement styling. Prism's website includes guidance on implementing the files and code, which I found to be very helpful too. So let's take a look at the steps to implement the styling. Step 1, go to Prism's website and download the CSS and JS files you need. First, check out the available themes shown on the right side of the Prism homepage. I ended up going with the Tomorrow Night theme by Rose Pritchard. Then scroll down the page to select the languages you need. I wasn't sure which version of JSON we were using, so I selected all the flavors just in case. Then continue scrolling until you get to the bottom of the page and click on both of those buttons to download and save the JS and CSS files. I also want to note that the overall size of the files we added to our project is under 2K. So this is a very compact solution. Next, you need to set up your project to use Prism. First, save the files to a folder in your project. I chose to put them in a syntax highlighting folder under resources. Next, update your topic or master page to call the script and link to the CSS. If you're going to be using code samples in a lot of your topics, adding the script to your master page saves the time and effort of manually adjusting the code in your HTML topics, and it will generally be available if you need it. The last step of implementing Prism is to paste your code sample into your topic and adjust the code tags to use the Prism style sheet. First, go to the topic or snippet, and in the XML editor, use the paste inline option to paste in your code. This step is important because it keeps your code sample formatted correctly. When you paste your code, you will see a little clipboard icon that gives you the paste options in Flare. That's where you'll be able to choose the paste inline text option. Then switch over to the text editor and add the code sample using pre and code tags. For Prism CSS to work correctly, the code tag must specify the language of the code sample with the class attribute, in our case, JSON. And that's it. That's Prism syntax highlighting. And now let's move on to our final challenge, which is how do we display large amounts of information in a single topic? As you saw in my API demo, the API help demo, each endpoint topic requires a lot of detail to explain how to use it and interpret the response. My solution is actually pretty simple. Use dropdowns to zip everything up and keep all main topic sections visible and easily accessible when you land on the topic. Then the reader can choose which areas to expand. Flare makes using dropdowns really easy. First, go where you want to add the dropdown in your topic. Then select dropdown text from the Insert tab. Another helpful UI element we added was a single and very obvious expand collapse button. This expands or collapses all dropdowns on the page and allows you to quickly view or hide large code samples. To adjust the button in your topic, go to the Skins folder in Project Organizer and open your topic toolbar skin. Then use the Style tab on the skin to access the options for collapse and expand all. You can also use these settings to add an icon or image to use for the collapse and expand button. Another item we added was a back to top button. This button becomes visible as you start scrolling down the page, as I showed during our help demo. This button makes it easy for your reader to quickly get their bearings when viewing a long topic or doing a lot of scrolling. I found this easy tutorial in Flare's online help to create the button. First, you need to add the script file to your project, and then add the script to your master page. All right, well, thanks so much for joining us today. Here are the links and tools we shared throughout our webinar. And that really concludes our prepared slides, but I think Mike has a few things to mention before we move on to your questions.
All right. Thank you so much. Before we move on to the question and answers, I have to do the obligatory marketing slides. And just by attending this webinar, you're basically getting a 10% off coupon for any of the upcoming Mad Skills type purchases you might make from the company. If you need any training, any consulting work, anything like that, or even licenses, there is no real code. You just, when you speak to your salesperson, just mention that you attended this webinar, and that will entitle you to that discount offer. And final announcement before we get to the question and answer, we are doing our absolute best to get Mad World up and running through all of this COVID scenario. I know we've had a lot of people really asking us, because they've been to some in the past and they want to go again. Officially, it is scheduled for June 12 through 15. It's not on this particular slide, but where all previous Mad Worlds were in San Diego, we've had several people say that that's not convenient. So this Mad World is scheduled to be at our Austin office. Well, not at our office, but in the city of Austin, Texas. That's a lot more central to the rest of the company. Hopefully it will reduce airfare, air travel, all of that, and be a little bit easier for some people. But that is scheduled for the middle of June. You know, obviously travel and world scenario permitting. But with that, hopefully our illustrious speakers have had a chance to peruse some of the questions that have come in, and it looks like a whole bunch more are coming in right now. So I will hand it back over for questions.
Okay, actually, Mike, do you mind reading the questions? I'm having some trouble seeing them.
No worries, we can do that.
Okay.
All right, so
Thank
the
you.
first question, it's a little bit more open. Your graphics and infographics are beautiful. Who created those?
That is very nice. Thank you so much. I actually created them, the first version of them, in Photoshop. I found some like little, like the icon, the little like hub. I found that and just kind of slowly built it up. And then marketing, the very first one I showed during the demo, our marketing department actually helped me beautify it. So it was an uglier version of that one initially, and then marketing helped to beautify it.
All right, excellent. Now, this one might be an offline question, but somebody was so impressed, they asked, has your company considered selling your API documentation template to other Flare users?
Oh, that is a good question. Can you ask that Can you please ask that user how much they're willing to pay and talk about it offline?
All right. Okay.
No, we have not considered it, but that's a huge compliment. Thank you. That's very kind.
Now, this one's a little bit more on the technical side.
Sure.
Somebody has asked, do you, and if you do, how do you handle different versions for one API?
That is a very good question. We actually we do not support multiple API versions here. We basically just show everything that's in the current version of the API. But if you have different companies using different versions of your APIs, I'm sure you could come up with a situation where you have different targets and conditions where you probably have to conditionalize specific parts of your API that are available only in specific versions of the API, if that makes sense. We basically just put in as a default, we put in a note just to caution users that you may not have access to all of these endpoints, or we bypass the whole version thing altogether.
All right, excellent. Now, I think you may have answered this one already, and maybe the viewer just didn't catch it. But it says Flare now offers syntax highlighting and code blocks. What's the difference between using Flare or the Prism that you recommend? I believe you did this before we even offered that capability, if I heard correctly.
That's right, Mike. We ended up going with this style because at the time the option for syntax highlighting, or I think it's called the code snippets feature.
Yes.
It was not available in Flare at the time. I haven't really played around with it because we've gotten so used to using the syntax highlighting and it's already built into our system that we didn't feel the need to switch over to code snippets.
Excellent. Let's see. Question about testing. Was testing the API help your responsibility or QA department's responsibility before release?
That's a good question. Well, you bring up QA. When I was testing the API for documentation purposes, I actually did a lot of QA on the actual API because sometimes things would come back that weren't expected. So there's that QA aspect. We did have our dev team and our product managers, like the people that are responsible for integrations at VDS. They went through and reviewed the help content in detail down to the data point level to make sure I called an integer, et cetera. So we did go through a good QA process. Not with the actual QA team, but with our dev team.
Okay. Somebody wants to know specifically what version of Flare are you using?
We're using the latest version. I just upgrade whenever there's a new version available. I go to the latest version. So I'm using that 2021. Is it R3 version? I think, Mike.
Yeah. Yes. R3 just came out last week.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, that's the version I'm using.
Yeah. All right. So a question on updates. How do you update the documentation and how often?
That's a really good question. It depends on your API. If your API is going through a lot of expansion and changes, you're going to have to update it as often as your dev team needs you to. Our API had a huge expansion last year, throughout the year, the first part of the year, and so we were constantly updating it, primarily to add new endpoints. And so we have like a what's new section in our API help, so users can click there and see the most recently added endpoints. But it really just depends on your dev team and your API. Like how often they update is basically how often you're going to have to update your documentation.
Excellent. Okay, so this next one is two parts. The first part, they just want to say thank you, very insightful presentation. And then part two, do you have any mechanism to solicit feedback from the people who use your API docs?
That's a great question. We want to add something in there, but at this time, there is just a way to send us a note. We don't currently support that, but we're looking to add something like that next year, or actually in this calendar year.
And to expand on that as well, we do we track metrics on how frequently the API help is used, and we actually get a lot of feedback from the integrations team as well, who do work directly with the third parties who are doing the integration. So that's our main source of feedback from the people who have interacted with our documentation portal.
Excellent. And that kind of leads into the next question. Similar vein, now that you've created a successful version 1.0, what are your plans for future improvements or a version 2.0? What's your dream list of where you want to take it next?
That's an excellent question, but Right now, we kind of built this API help before we thought about responsive design issues. And so it currently has a lot of tables. And so if I had like a whole month to do some revisions and improvements on usability, I would remove those tables and add some more responsive design elements. And Athena's more of an expert in responsive design, so I probably would work closely with her to create the best responsive elements to handle the content instead of tables.
Excellent. Great answer. Give me one moment. There's just so many questions that have come in. I'm trying to catch up.
Okay.
Oh, in what format do you receive content from the developers?
That's a good question. As I mentioned, I use Postman I actually use the API. So if they tell me there's a new endpoint coming, as long as I have credentials for that specific dairy, based in our system anyway, as long as you have the correct credentials, you can go and test that API or the endpoint yourself. So if they tell me, hey, I added a new endpoint under animals, it's called heifers. So put in heifers, I could just go to Postman, type in heifers in my URL, and then I can see what the response includes and which data points are in there.
Excellent.
But they do need to keep me informed. So that is important. You need to have good communication with your development team. We basically ended up having a shared Confluence page where whenever they add a new endpoint or adjust an endpoint, they put notes in this Confluence page, and then I know to go there, and I got like little check marks. Once I make that change in the help, then I mark it as complete.
Okay, great. Now, there is some feedback from an attendee. Apparently, they have used both Prism and the integrated new Flare code snippet capability.
Oh.
And their remark is that what you guys show is awesome. Just be careful. They've tried it, and it doesn't work if you need to produce a PDF, whereas the internal Flare technique works both web and PDF. So just kind of a side data point there.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Luckily, we only do online help, so it doesn't really affect us. But yeah, if you need to actually produce a PDF target, that would be something definitely to consider.
And that's what's amazing about these webinars. It's like some people have tried crazy, side attempts and things, and people are willing to share their own findings. So that's cool.
That's really cool. Yeah.
Okay, so this one gets a little bit deep.
Okay.
Do you author the REST API details in Flare by hand, or do you perform any kind of import and conversion of Swagger or Markdown type files into HTML?
That is an option. It is an option. I actually looked into it initially, but there were, at the time, right when I started documenting it, we only had like 20 some endpoints, and we wanted to not show some and show some others, that it was actually easier for me just to manually adjust the HTTP method for each topic, like which ones are supported. I have a snippet that I use for each different version. Like there's either we only have get and post endpoints or methods. And so I just have a snippet, and it's just easy for me just to plop that snippet in for either one. So it is a manual process, but it's pretty streamlined.
All right. Do you have a mechanism for the development team to alert you when an API detail needs to be updated?
Yeah, as I mentioned a little bit ago, we do have a Confluence page that we share where they make notes of, to that effect. Basically, like we decided to add another data point to this endpoint, or they keep me informed there. And we also have weekly meetings with the dev team, just like a stand-up to check in, and they'll usually give us a heads up there.
All right. Now this gets more into kind of how much you share. When writing the API architecture, did you have to consider how much you share with the customer before it reveals too much of the implementation data to pose a security risk?
Yes, that's a good question. Well, for our authentication purposes, we do require there's a a key and a token. So in all of those cases, we don't use an actual key or token. We just have a placeholder. So if they want to actually somehow try to get into our API and, you know, like, I don't know, do damage or get in there, I don't think they would be able to. So we're very generic about the fact that it's an API, that security works with an API key and token, but we don't actually provide those details. Does that answer the question?
I think so.
Okay.
All right, now I'm going to take some editor liberty here. There's kind of three related questions, and I'm going to kind of combine them together. What they all are trying to kind of get at, are you doing your own hosting on your own web server, or are you using any of the MadCap central site hosting?
We actually have AWS, and that's what we use. That's the platform we use for our cloud product. So we were able to work with our DevOps team and actually just host it on our server internally. So we've got URLs dedicated to our API help build. So we don't actually use Central or any of that other software.
Excellent. And now this one, I don't know, this is kind of interesting. Is your API documentation a completely separate standalone deliverable, or did it become a component of your just general online help and documentation?
That's a good question too. It is part of our Flare project. They all coexist. Our cloud product and the API help are in the same Flare project, but the help for each is standalone because the users of our software don't really want to see the API details. The API documentation is strictly for developers, integration partners, the audience that Athena mentioned. It's really not for our average user, which is a dairy farmer. So our dairy farmer does not want to see our API documentation. So they're basically standalone deliverables.
Or to extrapolate and simplify, one big Flare project, but multiple targets, correct?
Multiple targets, exactly, yes.
Perfect.
One thing we also did within the Flare project is it is quite a large Flare project for our cloud product. So we created API subfolders like within Content Explorer and under variables, so that we could really distinguish the API content and keep it somewhat separate from the main cloud product content. That has helped a lot.
Excellent. If it's okay with you guys, I'll grab this one, but somebody asks, can you give an example of what you mean by responsive elements? Responsive design is really talking about how content adapts to the size of the browser window or the device it's being viewed on. The idea behind responsive content is instead of 3 blocks of content side by side that force you to get a horizontal scroll bar if it's viewed on a smartphone, if that topic is responsive, maybe those 3 blocks do display side by side on a desktop monitor, but on a smartphone, they would automatically stack up vertically. So all the content is still usable. The content just self-adapts to the browser window or the device. Hopefully I didn't steal you guys' thunder. Do you guys have anything to add to that?
No, I thought that was a great explanation.
All right. I just thought you guys might want a break from talking for a minute. Question, do you test endpoints in a sandbox?
Yeah, we kind of answered that earlier. We actually have access to our sandbox environment. And so yes, we do test using Postman.
Okay. Now this one it's kind of an A/B analysis. She said, or the person says, I realize you talked about using Postman and all of that, but do you have access to the actual developer's code repos if you need to view the actual API definitions?
Oh, that's a good question. Sure. We have GitHub. We use GitHub here for source control. So I do have credentials. I can log in and get to the code if I need to. I generally do not need it because all I include is like the request and the response, which I can get using Postman. But if I wanted to, yes, I can go to the repo and actually view the source code.
Okay. Did you consider to integrate the actual Swagger UI. That's part A. And then part B, thanks a lot for a great informative webinar.
Yes, we did. As Athena mentioned earlier on, we were kind of in a rush to get going. And with Swagger, I did some initial research, like for importing it, displaying it, but we wanted to add more details. And so it wasn't just like a direct import. Direct import wasn't an option at the time. We knew we'd have to develop some new content that wasn't existing. So to build it out in Flare was the solution that was fastest for us. I think there's definitely options for importing it and working with the actual Swagger file, but we didn't go down that road.
All right, and we actually get to the end of the, oh, another one just popped in, but this is the second to last question because we are approaching the hour and we should finish right on time. So second to last question, how did you handle parameters, response fields, etc., that apply across multiple endpoints?
That apply, yes, that's a good question. We do have a lot of endpoints that share chunks of data. So as we showed, this is a lot of animal data. So we have a lot of genetics are really huge right now. So we have information like on the sire that goes into a lot of endpoints. And so what we did was we created a snippet with that, just the sires, the chunk of data that's sires, and we pull that snippet into multiple endpoints. So if you have chunks of data that are used in multiple endpoints, yeah, definitely create a snippet and just reuse it everywhere. That's what we did.
All right, and as I said, that was the second to last, so this will be the last question, and then we will officially wrap up.
Okay.
Can your readers test the API methods directly in the docs, or do you offer a separate Postman collection for that?
We do, and here we cannot test. Well, let me back up here. I think when our integrations team gets to the point with our integration partners that they are actually connecting and doing testing, they have a way to allow them to access the sandbox environment, so they test there. And what was the other part of the question? I'm sorry, Mike.
Oh, can your readers test the API methods directly in the docs, or do you offer a separate Postman collection?
Yeah, they would actually, we don't have a way to test the actual API in the docs. They would actually have to use Postman or some other tool to access to connect to the actual API in our staging or sandbox environment.
Excellent. All right, and I promised that was the last one, but somebody snuck one in. I'll just take it real quick. They were asking, hey, you guys referenced several links throughout the presentation, but we couldn't click. Not to worry, when you get your email, all of the slides will be included, and then you will have access to all of those clickable links. So yes, some of the links shared weren't clickable during the live webinar, but they will be when everything gets posted to our website. All right, so thank you everybody for attending. Thank you both of our amazing presenters. Do the presenters have any final comments?
Nothing more from my side, just except to thank everyone for being here and for your great questions today.
Yeah, same. It was really fun. Thanks, Mike, for the opportunity.
Thank you for lending us your time and your expertise. Thank you everybody for attending. On behalf of MadCap Software, thank you so much, everybody. Don't forget to check that website because there are more webinars always on the horizon. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great rest of today and an even better rest of your week. Cheers.